Now, speaking of rocky water, what has happened to UCLA? And we'll try and keep this one brief. I know, try and give me the Cliff Notes version, because I'm sure there's a lot more in there. But I left California in 2015. That was their last winning season. I read off the records to my wife. I'm like, you won't believe this. And she says, they should pay us to move back. I'm like, so UCLA, if you're listening, I'm available, director of football operations. I could be out there tomorrow. But what's happened? They were a 10-3 team. 8-4 was bad. And now 4-9, 3-8 has become fairly normal.
Scott, where do you live right now?
I live in Atlanta.
And there's where it all started. It actually started in Atlanta on signing day in 2015. You and I were both back in New York City doing the old signing day show for Scout.
Is this about when I said you're spending too much time trying to go head-to-head with guys in the SEC, and then you're surprised when you lose them? Is this where you're going with this?
This is where I'm going, because that morning they actually started off strong. They got a commitment from Chris Clark, who was the #1 tight end in the country, Soso Jamabo, the #1 running back in the country. And then late that morning, they got a commitment from Roquan Smith out of Georgia, right down to him putting the UCLA gloves, flashing them for the camera. A couple hours later, an article leaked out in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that Jeff Ulbrich, who was UCLA's defensive coordinator, was leaving UCLA after signing day to take over as the linebackers coach for the Atlanta Falcons. Since that moment, UCLA football hasn't been the same, because there was that.
That's crazy.
Oh, if you talk to UCLA fans, they'll all pinpoint it to that moment, because then that day, JoJo Wicker, who seemed like a longtime UCLA lead, picked Arizona State. Biggie Marshall was never headed to UCLA, but he ended up picking USC. A few months later, you had Kettlebell Gate between Sean Combs, Puff Daddy, and Sal Alosi, UCLA strength and conditioning coach. UCLA's offensive line coach, Adrian Clem, ends up getting suspended for all of spring football. Then that fall, UCLA starts the year. I think they end up 4-0, 5-0. Miles Jack gets hurt. They lose 4 starting defensive players in consecutive weeks, end up squandering all that momentum, go 8-5 on a team that at one point was expected to win the Pac-12, and they haven't recovered since. Jim Moore gets fired a year later. Chip Kelly comes in.
It goes down, but you're bringing in Chip Kelly. On paper, that looks like a good hire. You don't necessarily, UCLA should be recruiting well, but Chip Kelly's had success without having big recruiting type numbers. And you should be able to get enough players at UCLA. So, to put this bluntly, why has he been such an unmitigated disaster in his tenure at UCLA? I expected more. It's one of those, you can tell how media people were wrong when they get mad that they were wrong. I expected Chip Kelly to be a success, and it's been terrible.
As we all predicted, Herm Edwards was going to be the successful hire in that class, and Chip Kelly was going to be the disaster. And I think a lot of it comes from 2 different things. I think Chip Kelly came in, thought that he saw a program that was in disarray, ran off a lot of the talent that he didn't think needed to be there, ended up having to play a lot of young guys early on. Injuries never really helped him, but then their recruiting was always kind of questionable. It was always kind of curious. What were they doing in recruiting? And so now they have a class that's a little bit more junior-laden, senior-laden. As much as we talked about USC being 3 or 4 plays away from being 3-3, UCLA is 3 or 4 plays away from potentially winning the Pac-12 South this last year, but they couldn't close. Now they have the majority of their roster coming back. They do lose Osa Odigizua as well as Demetric Felton, who are probably their best players on offense and defense respectively, but there's talent coming back. If 2021 goes like the previous 3 years has done, I think Chip Kelly's tenure in Los Angeles is going to come to an end. But he has been saying privately for a couple of years now, hey, year 4 is when I really expect things to turn around and get going. Well, Chip, it's year 4. You better get those things turned around, or that buyout's going to be coming very, very friendly to you and your family.
UCLA shouldn't be a 4-8, 3-9 type of program ever. At USC and UCLA, there's enough players in that radius, 50 miles from campus. It's one of the few a handful of schools in the country that can recruit within 100 miles and then cherry pick, get a guy every once in a while, and still have success. So there's no excuse to have that type of futility in LA, as far as I'm concerned.